The Girl on the Road. Matthias had always believed that the solitude of rural roads was just part of the job. But that night, as he drove down the dark path surrounded by a thick forest, he sensed something different in the air, something too heavy to be mere fatigue. The silence seemed to hang on every beat of the engine, as if the darkness itself was listening to his thoughts, while the fine rain streaked the windshield. It was then, at the edge of his headlights, that a small silhouette appeared by the roadside. A girl in a white dress, motionless, holding a faded cloth doll. Instinct made Matthias slow down, overcome by a strange unease, and as he approached her, he felt an inexplicable chill run through his entire body, sensing that this night would not end like all the others he thought he knew so well. While trying to stay calm, Matthias offered her help, but the girl asked to be let into the truck bed, preferring the darkness behind the pickup to the seat beside him. Something about that choice bothered him, more than it should have, but tired and driven by the impulse to do the right thing, he simply agreed. The road was swallowed by the night once more as he drove, feeling the weight of an invisible passenger behind him, even though the rear-view mirror showed only the dark tarp swaying in the wind. When he reached the indicated spot, he called out to the girl, but no answer came. Upon opening the truck bed, he found only the strong smell of wet earth and the cloth doll left in the center, as if no one had ever been there. The feeling that something impossible had happened left his chest tight and his mind in a growing cycle of fear. The next day, under the clear light of dawn, Matthias returned to the spot and found Mr. Olavio, an older worker from the region, who revealed the truth that had circulated among the locals for years. He told him about the accident that had taken the girl's life 30 years prior, and how she and the doll had been buried in the old cemetery behind the embankment, now abandoned and forgotten by time. He also said that on certain nights, drivers passing by the curve swore they saw the child asking for a ride, always with the same doll in her arms, always with an empty gaze that seemed to pierce the soul of anyone who dared to stop. Every word from Mr. Olavio seemed to fit perfectly with what Matthias had experienced, as if the strange apparition from that night was part of a cycle that never came to an end. Months later, while driving down the same road again, Matthias felt the same pressure in his chest, as if the air grew denser as he approached the curve by the embankment. The headlights illuminated the winding road, and for a brief instant he saw, at the edge of the light, the pale outline of a white dress standing exactly where he had first found the girl. Without hesitating, he accelerated, refusing to look in the rearview mirror, but he still felt the inevitable urge to check, fearing what he might see there. To this day, he confesses to himself that he sometimes notices a white glow reflected in the dark glass behind him, as if the girl is still searching for the dolls she left behind, walking silently on the road she was never able to abandon. The uncle who disappeared. I was 12 when my uncle Angelo showed up in my grandparents' village after years without a word, and even as just a child, I immediately sensed that something in him had profoundly changed, as if part of who he was had gotten lost somewhere along the way. I remember the moment he stepped off the dusty bus, too thin, with sunken eyes and a distant gaze, as if he were hearing things no one else could hear. That night, during dinner, he barely touched his food and kept staring fixedly at the dark window, as if something outside was calling him. I tried to understand what was happening, but each of his silences seemed to hide a secret no one there was prepared to uncover. And when the house grew quiet, I would hear his slow footsteps in the hallway, accompanied by strange whispers I could never decipher. The next day, the village's calm turned to despair when my grandmother screamed that Angelo had vanished, that his room was empty and he had taken nothing with him. The search began immediately. Men combed the brush, dogs sniffed trails around the hills. Police asked questions that seemed to lead nowhere. For days, his name echoed among the trees and alleyways, but no trace was found, as if he had dissolved into thin air. I grew up with that absence, with the feeling that a part of my family had been torn away without explanation, and with the weight of a story that never found an ending. 30 years later, living in the city and working in my office, I received an unexpected call from a man named Eduardo, who said he believed he had seen my uncle on Pine Hill. He claimed the man looked identical to the old photos, without having aged a single day. My reaction was immediate, a mix of shock, disbelief, and a thread of hope I didn't even know I still possessed. I got in my car and drove down the dirt road towards the village, feeling every childhood memory return as if time had folded in on itself. The idea of reuniting with someone who had disappeared decades ago seemed impossible, but an inner voice insisted I press on. When I climbed Pine Hill, a cold wind cut through the air and twisted the trees as if trying to drive away any visitor. I called for my uncle countless times, scoured every rock, every corner, but there was no sign of any human presence. Only silence and the strange sensation that I wasn't entirely alone there. At dusk, as I prepared to descend, I saw a male figure standing further down the trail. The stature, the clothes, the posture, everything resembled Angelo exactly as he was on the day he disappeared. But I only had to blink for the figure to vanish, as if it had never existed. I descended the hill with a heavy heart, and the unsettling certainty that I had touched an invisible boundary between the real and the impossible. Back at the car, looking at the dark hill, I realized that place held something beyond what the eyes could see, something that had perhaps kept hold of my uncle all these years. Today, back home, I lie in my bed and look at the old photo of me standing beside him, and I often catch myself thinking that perhaps he never truly left. Perhaps he crossed over to a place where time doesn't exist, where people don't age, and where memories remain trapped forever. And sometimes I wonder if, when my time comes, I too will find the path to that same place, where Uncle Angelo might still be waiting for someone who remembers him. A bond for a lifetime. Since we were little, Ursula and I grew up like two trees born side by side, our branches intertwining so naturally that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. In our grandmother's backyard, we were inseparable. We ran across the bare earth, laughed loudly, invented worlds that existed only for the two of us. And there, in the simplicity of those golden days, I already knew she was more than my cousin. She was my sister, chosen by life itself. When we lost Aunt Helena, her world collapsed, and I held her all night, feeling the weight of the grief she carried, as if it were my own. She said I was her anchor, her solid ground when everything became too unstable to bear. And in that moment, I understood that there were bonds not even time dared to break. The years passed, and our differences became increasingly clear. While I sought refuge in my books, quiet, stable, she threw herself into the world as if dancing with life itself. Ursula was the flame, the wind, the light that drew everyone near. At parties, she was the center of attention, while I watched from a distance, silent, comfortable in her shadow. I admired her. I loved that brilliance she had. But I also learned to accept that our connection didn't need to be symmetrical to be profound. Each of us grew at our own pace, in our own soil, yet still intertwined by what we had shared in childhood. Then Leonardo came into my life. For the first time, someone saw me, truly saw me, not as Ursula's cousin, but as myself. He laughed at my quiet jokes, paid attention to what I said, and to my silences too. With him, I built a new world, brick by brick, date by date, until it led us to the altar. As we danced our first dance as husband and wife, I saw Ursula watching from afar, smiling. A beautiful smile, but slightly sad, as if she held on to something she had never told me. And while I found stability, she continued to live intense, passionate, fleeting romances that almost always ended in tears. I wished happiness for her, and though part of me was grateful that my own life had found balance, another part still feared she was losing herself while searching for someone who would see her as I had always seen her. Today, while making my bed in the morning, I found our childhood portrait on the nightstand. The two of us, covered in dirt, embracing, with smiles only children can give. I felt my heart tighten. Life pulled us apart quietly, without a fight, without a final period. We just followed different paths, different cities, routines that no longer intersect. But that bond, forged from the earth of our childhood, the shared tears, the nights spent together, never came undone. Sometimes I wonder if, in some other city, on some random morning, she also stops in front of a photo of us and wonders if I still remember. And I do. I always will. Encounter with an unidentified object. I was only 9 years old when that endless summer, forever, changed the way I would look at the sky. It was the kind of day where children played in the street until the sun disappeared, running between houses with the feeling that nothing bad could happen, while the late afternoon heat bathed everything in golden hues. I remember the smell of the warm ground, the sound of laughter echoing, and the ball bouncing off the walls. But then, out of nowhere, the atmosphere changed, as if someone had switched off the world. The sky, which had been orange and vibrant, darkened brutally, not like the normal onset of night, but as if a thick curtain had been drawn over the neighborhood. The wind stopped, and the birds fell silent all at once, leaving the air too heavy for a child to comprehend. It was in the moment I felt something deep in my soul, warning me that what was about to happen did not belong to our reality. When we looked up, we saw something so impossible that none of us knew what to feel. A gigantic object hovered over the houses, silent, round, and covered in amber lights that rotated slowly like eyes observing everything from above. It emitted no sound, no vibration, no perceptible movement. It was just there, so colossal it seemed to defy logic itself. Pedro started crying, saying it was the end of the world, while Olivia fell to the ground, unsure whether to run or pray. I hid behind a tree, unable to decide whether to flee or keep staring at that thing that seemed displaced from the universe. The fear wasn't of being taken or attacked, but of the deep certainty that it wasn't a visitor. It was a presence that could unravel everything around us merely by existing so close. The object then began to move, gliding down the street unhurriedly. As if the air were liquid, it cut through effortlessly. Its lights rotated slowly, casting strange reflections on the houses, as if illuminating not the present, but some kind of ancient shadow that had always been there. I watched it all from my hiding spot, every muscle in my body vibrating with tension, as that immense disc continued to the end of the street. And then, it simply ceased to be there. It didn't accelerate, turn, or vanish in a flash. It just stopped occupying the space, as if its presence had been cut out of reality. Soon after, the sky brightened again, returning to the warm tones of dusk, and the sounds returned so abruptly it made me dizzy. Nature seemed to resume its breath, and for a moment I wondered if it had even happened. The following Monday at school, no one mentioned it. The friends who had run away swore they hadn't seen anything, as if part of their memory had been torn out or erased. Olivia, who saw it all with me, moved away a month later without explanation. The street returned to its routine, but for me, every evening since has carried a silent weight, as if that moment had fractured some part of my perception forever. Even 30 years later, whenever the wind suddenly stops or the silence grows too dense, my body reacts as if I were still that child hiding behind the tree, watching the impossible. Today, when I return to that street and look at the sky from the same spot where it all happened, I realize that what we saw that night wasn't a flying saucer, nor a ship from another world. The feeling was different, deeper, more unsettling. The truth is, for an instant, the world seemed to tear, as if we had glimpsed beyond what was meant to be shown to us. And since that day, I've lived with the impression that we didn't witness a visit. We witnessed a glitch, an opening, and whatever peered from the other side still lives in the shadows of my memory, waiting for the moment when the silence falls in the same way again. The Shadow Watcher. The first memory always returns the same way. The heavy silence of the night, the wind beating against the window, and that strange feeling of being watched before I even had the courage to open my eyes. When I finally raised my head, I saw two bright points floating outside, staring directly into my room, motionless, calculated, cold. Just below them, a crooked head, too elongated to belong to anything I knew, tilted as if analyzing every detail of my child's face. From that instant on, I knew I wasn't alone, and that this presence wasn't a nightmare, but a silent visitor I would never forget, no matter how hard I tried to erase its image from my mind. When I pulled the blankets up to my nose and squeezed my eyes shut, the hallway made a slow noise, as if someone was dragging their feet on the floor. The light turned on by itself, leaking under the door, cutting through the bedroom's darkness with a yellow stripe. Before I could call out for anyone, I felt my ankles being pulled by an invisible force, dragging my body to the foot of the bed as I held on with all my strength. My fingers ached, my muscles trembled, and suddenly the light went out again. Just as it began, everything stopped. Little did I know that this would be only the first warning, a clear sign that it hadn't come to scare me just for that night, but to mark its presence for the rest of my life. Over time, I realized I wasn't the only one. In the schoolyard, while talking to Gustavo, I heard him describe something that made me freeze inside. A tall, thin figure with a strange head that prowled the hallway of his grandmother's house at night. He told me how his cousin also saw the same thing, as if it were normal, as if it were part of the family's silent routine. When he asked why I was so pale, I could only nod, feeling a strange relief at not being alone, mixed with an even greater fear upon realizing that the Watcher wasn't exclusive to my life. It moved, it appeared to others, it chose. Years later in my own apartment, I realized that running away was useless. That night, Tina growled at a corner so dark, it seemed to swallow the living room's light. When I followed her gaze, I saw it again. The tall figure with the triangular head, standing like a living shadow, slowly dissolving, like smoke being pulled into an invisible void. Weeks later, Larissa saw it too. We stopped talking at the same time, drawn to the completely dark hallway, where it stood motionless, watching as always. When she confessed she had seen it since she moved in, I realized it didn't belong to my past, nor to my childhood memories. It belonged to me. It followed me. And now, it followed whoever was by my side. Today, as I lean my forehead against the door and look through the peephole into a hallway that insists on seeming empty, I feel Tina growling behind me, and I know it is near, always waiting, always watching. I've spent my life trying to run from houses, from cities, from memories I tried to bury. But the Watcher never stayed behind. It was never tied to a place. It was always tied to me. And deep down, perhaps it's only waiting for the right moment to stop observing and finally act. The figure on the roof. The house where I grew up always seemed larger than it really was, as if the very air inside it weighed twice as much, smothering every ray of light that tried to enter through the narrow windows. During the day, it was already a place too quiet. At night, every creak echoed, as if it came from within the walls, following my steps even when I tried to ignore it. One such night, I woke with a tightness in my chest, an anxiety that didn't come from any dream, but from something that seemed to pulse within the darkness. Outside, the dogs were barking differently. It was a tense, directed bark, as if they were warning each other about something moving on the roofs, something that shouldn't be there. I sat up in bed trying to control my breathing, listening to the insistent sound of the dogs who seemed to know something I didn't yet have the courage to discover. I looked towards the wall next to my mother's room and noticed the absolute silence. She always woke at the slightest noise, but that night she had taken pain medication and wouldn't have stirred even if I'd screamed. That made me even more aware that, for the first time in a long while, I was completely alone. Even so, something pushed me toward the window. It was a strange impulse, almost as if my hands moved before my thoughts, slowly pulling the curtain aside with the fear I tried to ignore. I peeked through a minimal opening, just enough to see a fragment of the neighbor's roof. And that's when I saw it. A crouching figure, feminine, dressed in long, dirty cloth that seemed glued to her body. Her hair fell over her face, hiding everything, as if that bowed head guarded a secret so heavy not even the wind dared touch it. I froze. I didn't even have the courage to let go of the curtain. It was in that instant I heard a low lament, something between a stifled sob and a cry for help that seemed to travel across the roof until it hit not my ears, but my chest. It wasn't physical pain. It was ancient, profound sadness, as if it carried centuries of suffering. I threw myself back into bed, covering my head with the pillow, murmuring any prayer my desperate mind could recall. I don't know how long I stayed like that, trying to convince my body to remain still until the night passed. But an absurd, almost irrational courage made me return to the window. I looked again, with a sickening care, expecting to see her still there, but the roof was empty. The dogs, however, continued to bark, more spaced out, but alert. The next morning, I tried to tell my mother over coffee, but she didn't believe me. She said it was imagination, a dream, a child's fear. She didn't even look me in the eye when I mentioned the crying. She just told me to stop with the stories. Years later now, an adult in my own apartment, I was woken by a distant bark, the kind that cuts through the silence of the night like a knife. I opened my eyes in the dark and felt the same tightness in my chest, the same suffocating sensation that accompanied me that night. And I realized that, no matter how much time had passed, that lament, that crying from the roof, had never truly left me. When a dog barks in the darkness, I don't fear the bark. I fear what comes after. The heavy silence, the memory of the sadness crouched on the roof, facing my window, as if it were waiting for me to have had the courage to look longer that first time. The betrayal. From the beginning, something was wrong. A discomfort so subtle, it felt more like a whisper than a signal. But love, or the illusion of it, has that cruel ability to turn alarms into distant noises, easy to ignore. When Ursula showed up at our door with a suitcase in hand, fragile and lost, I didn't hesitate to take her in. Leonardo tried to smile, but his eyes betrayed something I interpreted at the time as mere discomfort. I should have listened to that internal silence, that small crack that opened in my chest. I should have heeded the warning, but we always think those we love are immune to the flaws that destroy others. We always believe that, with us, it's different. And that's how I allowed the storm to enter through the door of my own home. The first signs came like breadcrumbs scattered across ordinary days. A quick touch under the table during dinner. Intimate laughter on the balcony, where he and I used to share secrets. The sudden silence when I entered the room and found them talking in hushed tones. Leonardo fixing her necklace with care, with too much time, too much intention. I gathered it all in silence, weaving suspicions that burned like a hot iron in my stomach. Yet I still tried to justify every detail, trying to convince myself that trust was more important than paranoia. I wanted to believe it was all a product of my fear, not reality. Until the day fate decided to tear the veil and show me what I had pretended not to see. I came home early, tired, with a headache. I opened the door and smelled the strange scent of perfume mixed with the stifling air of the apartment. The muffled laughter coming from my bedroom froze my blood. I walked to the slightly ajar door as one walks toward a precipice. Through the crack, I saw the two of them entwined, their clothes on the floor like evidence of an intimate and cowardly crime. I pushed the door open. The creak cut through the air like a gunshot. They jumped, startled, naked and guilty, but no words could fill the chasm that had opened between us. I told them to leave. I didn't scream. I didn't cry there. The pain was so powerful that even sound seemed too small to contain it. I left the room, leaving behind not just the two of them, but the life I thought I had built. Then came the grief. The kind of grief that isn't about death, but that kills. Crying curled up on the bathroom floor, fingers trembling, trying to sleep on an unfamiliar mattress in an empty apartment, while my mind replayed scenes like an endless torment. Anger came in waves, shattering everything inside. Emptiness remained afterward, silent and devastating. Sitting in front of the therapist was admitting I had survived something that still lived within me. Talking about the pain was like pulling out a thorn buried too deep, but it was the only way to breathe again. I was learning to live in a new place, a place where betrayal wasn't a hidden monster, but just accumulated dust, ready to be swept away when I was strong enough. Today, sitting on a park bench, I look at the horizon expecting nothing and fearing nothing. I'm not smiling, but I'm not crying either. There's a fragile calm, built with effort, piece by piece. I discovered that when someone shatters you into 1,000 pieces, the challenge isn't in putting everything back together. It's in choosing which pieces still deserve to be part of who we are. And that's how I move forward, rebuilding, rewriting, reborn from what was left. The price of revenge. The moment the betrayal happened, I ceased to be who I was and became merely a shadow drifting through the city, consumed by a silence that screamed inside me and an emptiness that turned into fuel for something darker. Every step I took through the streets seemed to pull me further from the life I knew and push me into a territory where only one certainty remained. I wanted them to pay. It didn't matter how or when or the scale of the consequences. The air around me felt heavy, as if carrying the murmur of everything I'd rather forget, but which insisted on reminding me of the wounds they had left. And it was in this state, half alive, half ghost, that I met someone who seemed to see what I was hiding, as if my thoughts were printed on my skin. Sitting alone in an old square, trying to convince myself the world could go on without me, I met Donna Lydia, an elderly woman with a calm and disturbingly deep gaze, who seemed to measure my soul with a simple raised eyebrow. She said she could see the weight I carried, and her voice cut through the air, as if she knew exactly the reason for my torment. I didn't respond, but my silence was enough for her to continue, offering something I never imagined I would hear from a stranger: help to take justice into my own hands. There was something about her, a strange magnetism, that pulled me closer, as if the darkness consuming me recognized the darkness residing in her, and so I followed her without hesitation, like someone walking toward an inevitable fate. The basement she led me to smelled of old wood and something I didn't want to name. Lit candles formed circles of flickering light that danced on the walls, while dried herbs swayed gently in the heavy air. Donna Lydia prepared everything with slow, meticulous movements, like someone who respects what is about to be awakened. She warned me that revenge was not an ordinary path, that it demanded a price equal to the desire I carried. When she asked if I was willing, I simply nodded, captivated by the flame's glow that seemed to reflect my own ruin. The instant she said it was done, the air grew denser, as if a silent pact had been sealed between us and something beyond. In the days that followed, the news began to reach me without my having to seek it out. First came small incidents involving Leonardo and Ursula, accidents easy to explain, yet impossible to ignore for anyone who knew of the ritual. Spilled cups, unexpected falls, public humiliations, misfortune after misfortune, as if every detail of their lives had transformed into a reminder that the pain they had given me would now return multiplied. With each new disgrace, I felt a bitter relief course through my body, but along with it came a strange sensation, almost a warning that this wasn't the end yet, that the path of revenge was irreversible and was only beginning to claim its price. When the TV announced that both had died in a violent accident, my world fell completely silent, as if someone had sucked the air from the room. I thought I would feel victory, satisfaction, justice. But what settled inside me was an emptiness so profound it seemed to fill every corner of my mind. I returned to the basement only to find a note, saying that the true price was not the act itself, but carrying the consequences forever. And now, as I watched from afar as two headstones are lowered into the ground under the rain, I realized that revenge healed nothing. It only replaced the pain I knew with another, even heavier one. I walk away from that place knowing that, in the end, I was not the one who won. I was the one who became trapped by my own desire. The disturbing consequences. Instead of bringing the relief I so desperately hoped for, the revenge made room for something far more unsettling, a silent presence that seemed to draw closer with every breath I took. In the first few days, I tried to ignore it, believing it was just echoes of a guilt I didn't want to admit I felt. But I soon realized there was something there that didn't belong to the world I knew. That night, I woke up sweating, my heart racing, because I heard my name being whispered by voices I didn't recognize. They weren't human, they were multiple, overlapping, as if coming from a place where sound shouldn't exist. Since then, the whispers have become constant, filling the dark corners of my room, crawling along the walls, creeping under my bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it drawing nearer, waiting only for me to be vulnerable enough for it to fully reveal itself. Everything became even clearer when I returned home after an exhausting day and found fresh mud footprints tracking across the clean floor, leading straight to my bedroom. The door was locked, the windows firmly shut, and yet the bed appeared to have been used by someone who shouldn't have been there. I observed every detail, trying to find a logical explanation, but the heavy air and the oppressive silence insisted there was no logic, only a force I had invited myself when I accepted Donna Lydia's help. She had warned me about the price, but I had only paid attention to the promise. Now, that promise was twisting itself into my reality, as if it were shaping my destiny with invisible fingers, tightening their grip. The confirmation that this wasn't a product of my imagination came when I visited the graves of Ursula and Leonardo. I was about to clear some leaves from the headstone when I found a folded note tucked under a rock, written in a fine, disturbing handwriting. It said that the door I had opened could never be closed again. As I read those words, I felt a presence behind me, an icy breath on the back of my neck, even though the cemetery was completely empty. In that instant, I realized it wasn't just a message. It was a reminder that I had crossed an invisible boundary from which no one is guaranteed to return whole. And as I let the note fall, I knew it was with me now, wherever I went, observing every thought, every fear I tried to hide. The following nights became torture. Sleep became unattainable, and I wandered around my apartment with deep, dark circles under my eyes, drinking coffee at 3 in the morning, trying to keep my mind awake so it wouldn't find me the moment I closed my eyes. The voices grew louder, the shadows seemed to move in the corners, and the constant feeling of being watched became part of the very air I breathed. Desperate, I decided to look for Donna Lydia, believing only she could undo what had been done. But when I arrived at her old house, I found only broken windows, overgrown weeds, and the silence of a place abandoned for years. A neighbor told me Donna Lydia had been dead for 5 years, and that she had meddled with forces no human should ever touch. Now, sitting in the dark of my living room, utterly deprived of rest, I watch a dark stain form on the wall in front of me, slowly dripping as if it were alive. It expands, contorts, until it takes the shape of a distorted door, made of dense, pulsing shadows. The air around me grows heavier, as if something is about to cross over. I understand then that I did not summon justice. I summoned something hungry, something that isn't sated by the pain of others, but that consumes those who call upon it. And now, with the door open, I realize that the debt I tried to collect from others has come to collect from me. The haunted legacy. Silence had become the most deafening sound inside my house, because it was within that silence the whispers hid, waiting for the right moment to draw near. Sometimes I'd hear light footsteps crossing the hallway. Other times it was a short breath coming from a dark corner. But what truly destabilized me was hearing a voice I never believed I would hear again. It was as if someone had opened the past and let its memories walk through my present. One night, hearing a noise from the living room, I found only emptiness, except for a childhood photo of me and Ursula on the table, a photo I had stored deep inside a drawer. On her face, a phrase written in red asked why I had done it. From that moment on, objects began moving without explanation, disappearing and reappearing in places that defied all logic. I no longer knew if I was dealing with a presence or the collapse of my own sanity. At work, things also began to spiral out of control. During a meeting, I realized I wasn't really there. My eyes were fixed on a point on the wall, as if something were calling me. My colleague touched my arm to check if I was okay, and my startle was so intense everyone noticed my state. The physical and emotional exhaustion created a fog around me, making it hard to even distinguish what was real from what was influenced by that force I had attracted. Seeking answers, I entered the church and sat in the confessional. With a trembling voice, I confessed to Father Julio that the evil I had wished for had materialized and now inhabited my home. He explained to me that revenge consumes the one who ignites it, and that some doors, once opened, aren't easily closed. I left with a faint sense of relief, but also with the certainty that I needed more than words to confront what I had provoked. Desperate for solution, I sought out Adamir, a man whose serenity seemed to come from a deep understanding of what exists between the visible and the invisible. He listened attentively as I recounted what was happening, and then explained that I had created an energetic bond by desiring the destruction of Ursula and Leonardo. Guilt, he said, not only fed this bond, but strengthened the presence that now clung to me with ever-increasing force. To break this tie, he told me I needed to disconnect, seek help to understand my pain, and above all, leave behind the environment that had become poisoned with memories and echoes of what had happened. Sometimes certain places hold marks that time cannot erase, and staying there only reinforced my connection to everything I wanted to overcome. On the day I finally decided to leave, I stood in front of my apartment, holding a suitcase that felt lighter than the weight I carried inside. I got into the taxi with the feeling that I wasn't running away, but trying to survive. As the car drove off, I understood that repairing what was broken didn't mean fully closing the door I had opened, but learning to live with it slightly ajar, without allowing what was on the other side to pull me back into the darkness. Before the taxi turned the corner, I looked back at the apartment window one last time. For a brief moment, a dark silhouette stood there, motionless, watching. It was then I realized the legacy of what I had provoked would never completely disappear, but I still had the chance not to be consumed by it.